I want to begin with a story that many of us were taught because that story still shapes how people talk about Reverend Nat Turner today. I was taught that Nat Turner um, was a violent madman whose revolt went nowhere. This is taught to make Nat Turner appear to be foolish. Many are taught that nothing really happened or nothing really changed after Nat Turner's revolt. In other words, many were taught that Nat Turner was a tragic footnote, heroic, dramatic, but ultimately meaningless. But the historical record tells a very different story. Once you look closely at what happened after the revolt, it becomes impossible to say that Turner failed. In fact, if we measure impact instead of rather shall I say, morality tales, we have to admit something uncomfortable. Nat Turner shook the foundations of Virginia's political order. And that earthquake um, brought about aftershocks into the other slaveholding states. Let's be clear about what happened in 1831 without sensationalism and without myth making. Nat Turner's rebellion, or rather, shall I say, revolt or revolution, was not random. It was not spontaneous rage. It was not mindless violence. It was organized. It was coordinated. It was rooted in theology, literacy, and vision. Turner could read. He could write. He preached. He interpreted scripture. He believed that God was active in history and that judgment could come through human action. And most importantly, the revolt exposed something slaveholding society worked very hard to hide. Enslaved people were thinking, interpreting, organizing, and imagining freedom long before anyone, quote unquote, gave it to them. The revolt was suppressed. Turner was captured and executed. And if we stop the story there, it's easier to say, see, nothing changed. But that's actually where the real story begins. Because what followed was not silence and it was not calm. What followed was a political crisis. In the aftermath of the revolt, the Virginia General Assembly entered into months of intense debate so serious, so anxious that they would rarely be acknowledged in polite historical summaries later on. Lawmakers were forced to ask questions they had spent generations avoiding. Is slavery actually safe? Are white families actually safe? Is this system sustainable? Have we created a society that is permanently on edge? Should Virginia consider some form of gradual emancipation? These were not radical abolitionists asking these questions. These were slaveholders alongside their neighbors. These were legislators. These were people invested economically, socially, psychologically in the system. And the language they used matters. What Nat Turner also forced into the open was a rift among white Virginians themselves. Non slaveholding whites, people who owned little or no human property, if we want to use that term, began to publicly chastise slaveholders, not for moral reasons, but for making all white people feel unsafe. They were essentially saying, your wealth has made our lives dangerous. Your plantations have turned our communities into targets. Your refusal to change has trapped all of us in fear. Turner exposed slavery not just as a black problem or a moral problem, but as a collective risk, an unsustainable system that endangered everyone it touched. Turner forced non slaveholding whites to name slaveholding as socially reckless, not just cruel. They spoke of living in a perpetual state of insecurity. Go back and look at the records in the Virginia Assembly. They admitted that no white family could be considered truly safe. They warned that slavery threatened the peace of society itself. They feared that inaction would invite another insurrection. That is not the language of confidence, that is the language of fear. This is where Turner's true impact becomes visible, not in a battlefield, not in terms of battlefield success or taking territory, but in psychological disruption. Before Turner, fear in the slave system was abstract. It was something to be managed by patrols, distance, and denial. After Turner, fear moved inside the house. Fear sat at the dinner table. Fear walked through the fields. Fear stood in the kitchens. Fear slept uneasily at night. And here's another truth. When the people you claim are content, grateful, and childlike force you through insurrection to rewrite laws, restrict movement, censor preaching, and criminalize education, you are confessing that you never believed your own propaganda. If they were content, you wouldn't be afraid. And that brings us to what came next, the tightening of the Black codes. We are often told these laws were about control or punishment, but they were more than that. They were confessions. The law said, these laws said, without ever saying it directly, we fear Black literacy. We fear Black preaching. We fear Black assembly. We fear Black intelligence. We fear Black organization. Every restriction was an admission. Every prohibition revealed anxiety. Every crackdown confirmed exposure. Oppression is often a confession. And the Black codes confessed that Turner had exposed the truth the system could no longer hide. So, what then is Turner's real legacy? He shattered the myth of Black passivity. He forced the state to debate slavery openly. He exposed the fragility of a system built on violence and denial. He compelled the ruling class to admit their fear. He lived on not just in memory, but in political imagination. A revolutionary A revolutionary, pardon me, is not only someone who wins militarily. A revolutionary is someone who changes what the powerful believe is possible. And that is exactly what Nat Turner did. This matters today because history is often sanitized to project myths. Turner's story was flattened to protect white comfort. Complexity was removed so fear would not have to be confronted. But the truth is more human, more unsettling, and far more powerful. Nat Turner did not die in vain. He forced a state to confess its fear. He forced the state to admit the potential for Black power. And once fear is exposed, the myth collapses. And this is why Nat Turner's story still matters.